The Millionaire CEO dreamed of a woman he never met, until he saw her at his company. Night after night, the same city returned to Rafael Mendes, the same ocean light, the same laugh that seemed to belong to the horizon. In his dreams, the sand was cool beneath his bare feet, the sky a velvet smear of mauve and gold, and somewhere beyond the last line of surf, a woman would turn from the water and look at him, as if she'd been waiting. Her hair always caught the light in a way he could not describe. Her laugh was a chime he remembered as soon as he woke. Sometimes they walked along the shore and shared nothing but the quiet. Sometimes she sat with him on a cafe terrace and read from a book whose title dissolved before he could see it. Always, there was the same certainty, a tug at the chest that felt like recognition before it had a name. At 5 in the morning on a Wednesday in September, he woke with the sound of that laugh lodged between his ribs. The penthouse on Faria Lima was dark but warm, glass panes framing the city as a distant constellation. He could feel the ocean in the dream, even though his floor sat 40 stories above Avenida Brigadeiro Faria Lima, where glass towers arrayed themselves like a clean-lined skyline of ambition. The sheets clung to his skin. Beads of sweat cooled and left a faint smell of aftershave. Rafael lay still for a long moment, palms flat on the mattress, listening to the residual echo of a city he had never loved and, until those nights, barely noticed. He was 32. By 28, he had co-founded Tech Solutions Brazil and spent the years in a self-shaped orbit. Strategy calls at dawn, investor dinners at dusk, negotiating enterprise contracts with the kind of calm that makes people either trust you or resent you. His suits hung like armor. His gestures were efficient. People called him decisive. His board called him visionary. He kept problems compartmentalized, converted risk into spreadsheets and back into capital. Yet the dreams threaded through his armor like a foreign vine, persistent, inexplicable, demanding an inventory of parts he had long left unchecked. The morning ritual was unchanged. A shower, quick and deliberate, black coffee, bitter enough to be honest. 30 minutes of an inbox he skimmed like a surgeon examining vitals. Carla, his assistant, had already left 3 messages before he sat down at his marble counter. A reminder about the Petrotech pitch at 10, a note that Dr. Fernando Santos would arrive 20 minutes early, and a final practical instruction. Don't forget, Marcelo from legal will be on the bridge for the contract clause. She signed it with a soft digital smiley, an affectation he tolerated because it made the office run. Petrotech was large and conservative, an energy group looking for solutions to optimize operations. The contract meant credibility in a different register. Landing Petrotech could tilt a sliding scale of potential clients toward Tech Solutions Brazil. Rafael had rehearsed it in ways that made his muscles used to the motion of success. The opening line about data-driven resilience, the confident pivot to user-centric security, the handshake. He had not rehearsed the sensation of being unmoored by a laugh. The boardroom on the 33rd floor smelled of lemon polish and brand new leather. Sunlight slanted between slats and painted the table long and hard. Executives arranged themselves like chess pieces around the gloss of the conference table. Nameplates announced titles with clean authority. Rafael watched the room with the quiet attention of someone who knew how to read people as if they were technical specifications. Marcos, his co-founder, sat to his right. Easy grin, sleeves rolled, a natural counterweight to Rafael's contained gravity. Marcos winked at him and mouthed, "You got this." When the door clicked and the Petrotech team entered, Dr. Fernando Santos, tall and precise, and Helena Rodriguez, with an executive calm that seemed to come with the way she crossed her legs, Rafael rose to greet them. The initial protocols unfolded, handshakes, smiles that were all handshake, small talk about quarter-on-quarter performance. Then the room's rhythm changed subtly. A quiet woman in a dark blazer moved behind Dr. Fernando and adjusted a projector with deft hands. She had a traveler's poise, no attempt to announce herself, no borrowed corporate bravado. She carried a slim laptop like an instrument. The way she set cables and tested slides suggested she knew the machine as well as the meeting would need to know her. Rafael looked at her and felt, absurdly, a deficit of breath. For a second, the world mitigated into the grain of her fingers plugging a cable, the soft metallic ring of a connector finding its place. This was the woman from his dreams, the curve of her mouth at the edges, the way her hair had caught light in the same impossible way. His heart, which had learned economy, betrayed an old, wasteful language. Surprise, then recognition,
then a stupid, immediate hope. He pushed his chair back. The room assessed him as the named head of the able. They knew him as the man who spoke for strategy. He greeted the Petrotech delegation. "Dr. Fernando, Helena, good to see you. Let's make tonight about solutions." He smiled and leaned into the motion that stabilized the shape of meetings. Her voice was quieter than he expected. It registered like a new frequency under the hum of air conditioning. "I'm Isabella Costa," she said, by way of introduction, and when she met his gaze, she did not look astonished. There was a professionalism there, and something else, a thin, guarded curiosity. Her English had a cadence softened by time abroad. A glint in her eye suggested she had navigated Silicon Valley. She sat 2 chairs away from Dr.
Fernando and tapped the presentation into life. The meeting moved with the necessary competence: slides, diagrams of load prediction, interface mock-ups, notes on integration. Isabella spoke in clean sentences that wove technical confidence and user empathy. She had been at a multinational. She knew the architectures that scaled. When she explained a potential migration strategy with clear milestones and a fallback plan, the room relaxed into the kind of trust that investments thrive on. Rafael watched her hands as she spoke. The city outside marched on in its geometries: taxis, buses, an employee running late across the plaza, and inside the table, a different map calibrated itself. After the formalities, the air tightened. There was a coffee break like a comma in the meeting sentence. People drifted to the smaller table. Cups chimed. Rafael found himself beside Isabella as she stirred sugar into an espresso, the tiny spoon making a steady little clockwork sound. For the first time, they were close enough that the scent of her perfume, a citrus thing undercut with amber, touched him like a punctuation. "You were in California?" he asked, because the information had been an impression in the way of the world, a probable fact from how she tilted her head, the trace of an accent. "Silicon Valley," she corrected, with a small, frank smile that suggested the 2 places were a single memory he had not parsed. "A few years with a search company, product analytics. Came back last year. My grandmother needed me." There it was then, the anchor. She had come home to a grandmother, not to romance. The detail made her more present, not less, a person of obligations, not a fable. He told her, briefly, about the company's pivot toward enterprise, how they were adapting their monitoring stack to on-premise constraints. She listened with the kind of attentiveness that read curves and tolerances in conversation. Between them, for the width of a coffee table, the gaps shrink the way city blocks shrink on foot. At one point, Marcos lingered nearby, and with a "see how it's going for you" expression, asked Isabella where she was from. "Rio originally," she said, "but Sao Paulo for work and family." The name Rio placed another brushstroke in the dream's geography: Copacabana, the sea. Rafael's chest tightened with a strange, private ache. He found himself wanting to ask more foolish, impractical things. Did you ever go to Copacabana at sunset? But workrooms are places for contracts, not confessionals. After the meeting, they walked back toward Rafael's office in the building as a smaller band. Dr. Fernando and Helena exchanged formalities with Marcos. Rafael lingered. In the lobby, Isabella's phone buzzed, and she smiled at a message, something tender and practical, and Rafael noticed the way she answered with a clipped Portuguese, a comfort language. She was bilingual. She carried both cities inside her, like he carried 2 worlds on different timers, the ceaseless metric of work and the interrupted language of rooms that mattered. That night, the city blurred into a series of necessary motions. He reviewed the meeting notes, signed a few approvals, and when the pinched exigencies of startup life slackened, he returned to the suite. He tried to pin the woman from his dreams to a rational memory, the hair at the nape of her neck, the tilt of her eyebrows, but each attempt was like trying to draw the tide into a jar. He poured another black coffee and sat by the window to watch the city turn itself off, one light at a time. If you want to see how a dream can upend an empire, keep watching. The next days were a pattern of pleasant friction. The Petrotech contract required more hands on deck, and Isabella's name kept popping in emails, like a new variable being introduced to a steady equation. She became the bridge between Petrotech's technical demands and Tech Solutions Brazil's capacity. Rafael found himself scheduling time next to her on planning calls, not out of habit, but from a private necessity. He wanted to understand the edges of her thinking. There were moments small enough to be almost invisible and large enough to reroute affection. The first time he saw her laugh outside the clinicality of a meeting was at a narrow cafe on Rue Oscar Freire, where she took him because she liked the espresso and because she knew the owner, someone who made the coffee with patient hands, almost ceremonially. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and lemon peel, and the afternoon light lay across their table in uneven gold. They spoke of product roadmaps and between paragraphs about load forecasting, of the dull, bright things that make up a life, the stack of plates her grandmother collected, the train rides that used to be long and silent when she was a child, the childhood dog that always waited in a doorway. He told her, in the way he told certain people, about his father's business-light absence, the way divorce had carved out a sterile wing of his heart. Where she expected retraction, he found only a careful admission that the rooms he'd built in himself were serviceable, but often empty. He did not phrase it as loneliness, he framed it as familiarity with order. She nodded like someone cataloging a pattern she recognized from other lists. They began to move in the same orbit. Work hours blurred into after-work coffees that became dinners. Isabella accepted invitations with a practical curiosity and the kind of honesty that invited reciprocity. "I'm careful," she would say, measuring a forkful of food, "but I don't want to be cautious about everything." Those were not confessions, they were terms. Rafael, who had rarely negotiated the terms of his heart with anything but spreadsheets, found he liked the sound of them. Marcos noticed.
"You look different at the table," he muttered over a late-night bottle of red in the office lounge. Packages of takeout sat opened and half-consumed. "You're smiling at the slides, and that's not a thing I thought I'd ever say." "She's competent," Rafael said with more of a smile than he intended, "and present." "And your sleep?" Marcos asked with the bluntness he deployed when affection required practicality. "Still waking up at 3 a.m. like the city is a leak?" "It's better," Rafael surprised himself. He could not tell Marcos that the dreams had shifted from disembodied images to something that felt like a promise. He could not tell him how afternoons in the office now tasted slightly of possibility. Isabella's past hovered near them, an absence that explained presence. She had been orphaned early. Her grandmother, who raised her in Copacabana, had been the axis around which a small world turned. That woman's death had been practical and private. Funeral arrangements, an apartment of memories to sort through, the decision to return to Sao Paulo for work. Isabella had come as one does when duty outweighs delay, and once there, she had found her feet again in the architecture of code and meetings and colleagues who valued competence more than proximity. Rafael's childhood came in flashbacks, not in long exegeses, but in the way he noticed small things and kept silence about them. There were images, his mother packing a suitcase at dawn, the hush of the house after the argument, the smell of cold coffee his father drank when he stayed. At school, he learned to be efficient. At 32, he had learned to keep the life that would complicate his calendar as a private ledger. Against that ledger, the woman who had once been a nightly mirage placed soft charges. There were practicalities to love in a company as public as his. A romance in a workplace is a problem that needs strategic handling, HR policies, perception management, optics for investors. Carlos from HR, a man who reveres structure, would have opinions long and unsparingly formulated. Rafael, who valued order, found himself arching small rebellions, calls home made from the office on a Tuesday evening that lasted past the official end of day, a text exchange that read like a protocol between two people trying on the edges of intimacy. But intimacy has its own architecture, a touch that lingers on the back of a hand, a dish rinsed rather than left in the sink. The first time he cooked for her in his penthouse, he chose a recipe he had read about once, risotto with mushrooms and lemon. It seemed ceremonial and domestic at once. The apartment smelled of butter and wine and something grown up about making a dinner as if the act could certify tenderness. Isabella arrived carrying a bottle of wine and a small bouquet, sprigs of rosemary tied with twine, practical and aromatic.
She moved in the kitchen with a focused confidence she used in meetings, and Rafael watched her as if she were another form of elegant code. They ate with city lights like a scatter of glass around them. There was the usual small talk, stories about colleagues, news bits, but then conversation folded into a quieter place where honesty could be exchanged like currency. Rafael told her about the corporate decisions that had been hard but necessary. She told him about her grandmother's hands, how they smelled of starch and soap and an indestructible tenderness. When Rafael admitted, clumsily, that he sometimes dreamed of a stranger who seemed to know him better than his own biography, Isabella's eyes softened, but she did not offer platitudes. "Dreams are strange maps," she said. "They point somewhere, but they don't come with GPS." They talked that night about home. For him, Sao Paulo had been an adopted city, an engine. For her, it had been and remained a choice, a place where she had built a life outside the beach of her childhood. He liked the balance, not denial nor resignation, but an understanding that each had a habitat and that habitats could overlap without losing their shape. It was not all sweetness. There were disagreements, once over a code merge that risked a deadline, another time about the way Rafael trusted instinct over data. In those moments, his managerial voice came back, calibrated, urgent, and she pushed with the quiet ferocity of someone who understood systems and wanted them to be fair. The friction did not undo them. It made their conversations deeper, and where compromise required a choice, they found a middle ground. Relationship, when stripped of romantic plot devices, is a series of small reconciliations. There were rituals that began to anchor them. After a week, they developed one, a walk through the company lobby at dusk, past the mural of a Sao Paulo skyline that seemed never to age, to the corner where a small restaurant made late-night sandwiches. They called it a reset. It was the only time they allowed themselves to talk trivialities, music, books, what they would eat if the world ended. Those walks were less about the sandwiches and more about the permission to lean into a life that included someone else. Isabella's competence shone again when the project demanded more than charm and slides. There were technical obstacles. Petrotech's legacy layers resisted integration, and for a week the team hit a plateau. Rafael had confidence. Sometimes that meant optimism, and sometimes it meant stubbornness. He leaned on Isabella for both the practical solution and the moral of it, how to hold steadiness in the face of an inherited tangle. She offered a reorganization of the sprint, recommended a middleware approach, and stayed late in the office with the engineers until the problem yielded. Watching her in that mode, a person belonging fully to work and to the way it affects people, shifted something in Rafael.
He saw a version of partnership that was not ornamental but necessary. Their intimacy accelerated in ways that felt believable because it was woven through work. Shared breakfasts on the company terrace, the exchange of playlists that traveled between offices and phones, the way he began to keep a spare sweater in his car for her because she forgot her coat one humid evening. Yet everything remained tethered to a reality he respected. They did not elope mid-quarter or indulge theatrics that would threaten stability. That restraint, in its own way, made it easier to be vulnerable. One night in October, a rainstorm caught Sao Paulo in a sudden tropical fury. Sheets of water slapped at the windows. The city hissed beneath the downpour. Isabella had been at Rafael's for a dinner that turned into an improvisation. He burned the risotto's top layer, and they laughed and ate it anyway. After, the rain made hush of the world, and they sat on the narrow terrace with a blanket and a bottle of wine, watching the flares of taillights become rivers. "I don't understand why I kept dreaming you," Rafael said, voice small against the rain. "Sometimes I think my mind is trying to fix a problem it doesn't have words for. Maybe your mind wanted to find something it couldn't measure." Isabella turned her face toward him, and in the light he could see the careful architecture of how she tested speech. "Maybe it was trying to ask you a question you weren't in the habit of asking yourself." "What question?" "Whether you wanted a life that included someone," she said, not accusing him, only outlining an option. He closed his eyes. There it was, the honest fracture. He had been building an empire that operated on certainty. Relationships, messy and luminous, demanded risk. The dreams had been an irritation at first, a recurring glitch in an otherwise optimized system, but now they felt like a map with edges he had not been taught to read. They moved into a new cadence where both work and the small domesticities demanded skill. The company functioned. The Petrotech contract moved into a pilot phase. Isabella's presence in client rooms became an asset. She had a way of translating the kinds of user stories executives sometimes forget to ask for. Rafael found that in meetings he trusted her more than he trusted his gut. The strange irony was that the dreams, which had seemed like a private eccentricity, were remaking the way he made decisions in the daylight. One evening, after a long day of problem-solving and client calls, Isabella called him from the street. "There's a boulangerie on Paulista that makes the best pão de queijo," she said, and the sudden smallness of the invitation felt like a bridge. He met her there. The bakery was warm and smelling of cheese and butter. A radio played an old bossa nova track at low volume. They ate standing, leaning into a communal counter, a simple pleasure that felt like an anticlimax to the drama of his day, but was, in truth, a quiet confirmation. The ordinary felt good, and ordinary can be an anchor as much as any grand gesture. Inside her life, there were things that would not simply be smoothed out by dinners and shared laughter. The memory of her grandmother's hands was a tender wound that time had not closed. There was a subtle sorrow that sometimes shadowed her, a hesitation before committing to something that might echo loss.
For Rafael, whose emotional vocabulary had been economically modest, this was instructive. Love was not merely desire, but also patience and a willingness to sit in the small griefs that make a life. The closeness deepened outside the metrics of work. There were mornings they spent at Ibirapuera Park, where the great trees made a canopy over a city that otherwise emphasized angles and glass. They walked slowly under the shade, listening to the city's softer rhythms, children playing, dogs panting, the click of a cyclist's tire. On one of those walks, Isabella stopped beneath a broad tree and said, quietly, "When I was a child, my grandmother used to tell me that places hold memory. She'd say, when you hold a place in your heart, it keeps you warm on cold days." Rafael listened because she had a way of making sentences feel like offerings. He leaned his shoulder against the tree's trunk and imagined their lives parked in the shade. Meetings, code, residual grief, shared breakfasts. In the cool, filtered light, the idea of a life with someone else did not feel like an assault on his plans, but like an extension of them, work that had a warmth to it. There were, of course, moments of doubt that punctured progress. Once a rumor circulated about a possible acquisition, and Rafael found himself retreating into a work tunnel where conversations were practical and short. Isabella noticed and did not shame him. She asked questions that required more than a resume to answer. If you sold, she asked during a late night on the terrace, what would you be selling besides the company? The question reached through to a level of his life he rarely examined. He realized, with a brief physical shock, that he was selling more than software. He was selling a version of himself that polished away accidents and vulnerability. The thought made his throat tighten. He told her, and she listened with an unhurried patience that made it easier to return honesty in a voice that did not have to be performance. This was the pattern that began the months: small rituals, professional collaboration, and a quiet charting of inner landscapes. Rafael's dreams changed too. The woman at the shore no longer always kept the distance of a dream. Sometimes she reached for his hand, and the scene stuttered into mundane things like a broken tile or a lamp that would not light.
Those seams between dream and day narrowed and expanded like breathing. Never did he declare them as proof of fate. They were simply experiences that reframed decisions he might have otherwise deferred. Work continued to press in with the inexorable rhythm of startup life. The Petrotech pilot entered a technical review phase, and Rafael found that he could not entirely separate the professional stakes from the personal. Petrotech's executives were not oblivious to the human elements at play. They were practical, and Dr. Fernando, with a smile that acknowledged the suspect entanglement of things, said once in a pause, "It's good to see teams with chemistry." The remark soured Rafael's stomach for half a second, because chemistry in a corporate context is both praise and a liability. He and Isabella handled the comment with a levity they did not feel. There were small missteps. A news blog picked up on the relationship and ran a speculative piece titled something about distractions at the executive level. It was careless and petty, and Rafael felt, for an instant, the old reflex to dampen. He addressed it, clear, transparent, policy compliant. He defended the company's integrity while constructing a buffer that protected both their careers. Isabella appreciated the professional handling, and in private they discussed what it meant to love in public. They agreed on boundaries, as if a relationship could be managed like a project. Perhaps a romantic cliché, but it worked because both of them were, at the core, people who loved systems. One night, after a roll of tedious approvals and a concession to headaches in both their calendars, Isabella invited him to a quieter corner of the city, a place close to her memories, a small bar that played bossa nova and had dim lights. She wanted to show him where she used to go as a student, where the city felt less like a machine and more like a collection of rooms. They sat close, the world folded away to the hum of conversation and a record player. She told him a story about a young woman and her grandmother hitting the pavement to buy bread in the mornings, about how the grandmother insisted on always leaving the house with a coin in pocket for luck. The story landed like an offered heirloom, practical superstition, laughable and tender. He listened and felt again the heavy, necessary thing of building a life. It meant collecting other people's stories and deciding to carry them. He did not romanticize the sacrifices that had made her. He cataloged them like a field researcher, and found himself less interested in cataloging than in participating. The dream that had once been a puzzling nightly visitation now felt like a pointer toward possibility. Rafael had been built on certainty. Isabella kept offering him an argument for risk.
The story continued in small gestures, shared errands, the way each began to set up small domestic signals, the spare toothbrush behind the sink, the coffee preferred by name, the small sign on Rafael's desk that read something practical in Portuguese, "Não se esqueça," don't forget, the phrase she had used the first week when she optimistically insisted he attended late company lunch.
When weekends came, they were not extravagant escapes but comfortable presences. Bookstores turned into afternoons, occasional drives out of the city to the coastline, which, when they happened, reminded Rafael of the initial shape of his dreams: ocean, sand, laughter. And yet there was one moment, unexpected, ineffably intimate, that felt like a hinge. It happened after a long day of code merges and an all-night conference call. They had wound down, television on but ignored, couch between them like a no-word zone. Rafael reached for the remote and instead tuned into something else, her hand, small and solid in his. He did not think much before his fingers entwined with hers. The gesture was simple and entirely non-performative. It was an intersection of two itineraries. They did not speak for a while. In that silence, Rafael felt a catalog of things he had not admitted: fear that love might complicate what he had built, hope that maybe it could add to it. Isabella squeezed his hand, then leaned into his shoulder, inhabiting a place in him that had been left for sterility and numbers. He put his arm around her without planning, and felt how it fit, not as destiny unfolding on a script, but as an accumulation of decisions that had become tender. He slept that night without dreams for the first time in weeks, or if dreams came, they were gentle and personless, less urgent, less demanded. He woke before dawn with a kind of quiet he had not known in years, which was both sweet and terrifying. There were still questions about career moves, about public perception, about whether two people with different paths could become a joint future. There were still routines to be negotiated and boundaries to be set, but for the first time the less quantifiable possibilities, home, tenderness, repair, felt close enough to begin practical work. Rafael walked into the office on a Monday carrying an ordinary weight of responsibility and an unreasonable new patience. The city around him moved as it always did, and yet things had been rearranged inside his chest. The woman from his dreams, the woman he had never met until he had, no longer only existed in the night. She ordered his coffee in the morning and argued about code at lunch. She taught him the value of asking small, honest questions. The life he had been building for the marketplace had begun to expand toward the private. There was still a loop of worry that filtered through. Every decision had consequences, and some decisions could unspool the delicate pattern they had woven.
But for now, Rafael let himself feel the gentle conviction that sometimes a life redirects not because of force, but simply because someone else's hand fits into yours, and you try for the first time to walk together. They had not yet reconciled all the externalities: investors to placate, PR to manage, legal forms that refused to be poetical. There would be a season of questions ahead. How public would they be? How would the company navigate perceptions of impropriety? What would it mean for a CEO to let a personal life affect corporate optics? Those questions waited like traffic at a light, necessary and frustrating. Inside the office, under fluorescent reliability, Rafael sat in his chair and opened a document. The Petrotech pilot required a set of acceptance tests. He skimmed a list and then noticed a cursor blinking in an email draft to Isabella, asking whether she had 10 minutes to review the changes. He smiled and hit send. There was a meeting at noon with Dr. Fernando and Elena to review the next milestones. The room hummed with the same efficient gravity. Isabella walked in and set up her laptop as she always did, with competent hands and a soft humility about her eyes. She caught his glance and for a fraction of a second smiled. The world, for all its obligations, felt carefully arranged around a new possibility. Outside the window, the city continued, alive and indifferent. Inside, two people moved through the small, precise acts of building something together, routines that could, with time, become the architecture of a shared life. The dream that had started it all remained a curious footnote, a mystery kept not for proof, but for the way it had rearranged decisions. And as the meeting began, slides, timelines, the slow and patient work of companies and contracts, Rafael found with a quick inward breath that the sound of Isabella's laughter, whether in a dream or in the boardroom, had become part of the soundtrack he wanted to live by. He sat up straighter and listened. The meeting unfolded with the kind of professional gravity Rafael had learned to cultivate. Slides shifted, numbers were parsed, questions were answered in the measured voices of people trained to reduce uncertainty. Isabella moved through the technical review with a steadiness that made the room exhale. Her diagrams cut through assumptions, and when she suggested a phased rollout with clear rollback points, even Dr. Fernando nodded with a kind of relieved respect.
Rafael sat beside her, tracing the cadence of her voice, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to learn the edges of her mind, as if he could map a person the way he mapped a system. After the meeting, there were handshakes, polite comments about timelines, and a closing handshake with Dr. Fernando that felt like the end of a small battle. The team lingered to file notes and make last-minute adjustments to the pilot plan.
In the corridor, Isabella brushed past a potted plant, and a dry leaf scuttled along the tile like a secret. Rafael offered her the final printout. She took it, and their fingers met for a moment. An ordinary contact that steadied him like a fingertip on a steering wheel. The next months settled into a pattern both familiar and new. Work demanded attention, sprints, code reviews, integration tests, but there was another architecture being built just beneath the daily grind, rituals and phrasings that belonged to two people negotiating the logistics of togetherness. They learned each other's small preferences, how Isabella warmed her coffee in 10-second bursts, how Rafael kept his shirts folded with their collars facing the same way. She carried a small packet of oregano in her bag that she said her grandmother always tucked into a lunchbox for luck. The couple of spare toothbrushes on the bathroom shelf became a private message of intent. Little domesticities, once laughable to a CEO preoccupied with market share, began to register as the scaffolding of something permanent. Marcos noticed. He had been with Rafael since before Tech Solutions Brazil had tidy offices and polished PowerPoints. He had seen the company take on a life of its own, and had watched Rafael become its unmistakable face. One evening, over stale pizza and cheap red wine in the back of the office after a long sprint, Marcos said, half joking, "You're making spreadsheets for your heart now." Rafael rolled his eyes, but couldn't stop the grin that followed. Marcos, practical and prone to humor, was also the one who would give the blunt counsel Rafael sometimes needed. And Marcos had his own crossroads. A headhunter had slipped him an offer, larger title, more money, a different skyline. It was the kind of opportunity that asked a man to pick between loyalty and career, between the small community they had in the company and a brighter professional horizon. He confided in Rafael one night on the terrace, the city lights below them like a scattered constellation. "I could go," he admitted, not yet asking permission, but testing the air for moral friction. "It's tempting, but the thing is, I don't know if I want to start again where I'm a stranger." Rafael listened. He had long been the one to decide for others. Where Marcos's future was concerned, he paused. It wasn't only business. Marcos had been the person who had navigated him through the early chaos, who had reminded him to eat more than once a week. The company's growth had cost them the ease of earlier years, and both men understood that what they were choosing now would matter to the shape of their lives. Rafael suggested a weekend in the interior, away from clients and cap tables, where decisions could be made without the pressure of immediate returns. "You don't have to choose because of me," he told his friend. "Choose because it makes you feel alive." These conversations, their small honesty, became part of the weave.
Marcos stayed, deciding that the value of what they had built together outweighed a sleek elevation, and his choice created, for Rafael, a demonstration that some commitments in life were not transactional. That night, in the dim light of the office lounge, Rafael felt the familiar, delicate alchemy of trust taking form. It required risk and reward in equal measure. But life, especially life under the fluorescent clarity of corporate scrutiny, has ways of complicating even deliberate choices. A business blog, hungry for gossip and clicks, ran a suggestive piece about the cozy alliances forming at Tech Solutions Brazil. Photos of Rafael and Isabella leaving the building together, captions that implied impropriety in the client relationship, and a headline that read like an accusation of unprofessionalism landed in the company's inbox like a small, careless grenade. The article insinuated that Petrotech had favored Tech Solutions because of personal ties and not because of a rigorous pilot. Rafael handled it with the decisiveness he had always used for risk. A briefing to the board, a statement for the press that balanced transparency with protection, and a reinforcement of governance processes were put in motion. He clarified the procurement steps, published a redacted timeline of technical milestones, and suggested an external audit for the sake of optics. To the public, it was a professional response. In private, the mechanics were messier. Isabella read the piece in the quiet corner of the cafe they frequented. She had been watching a junior engineer present some mock-ups and had stepped away, and there, in the soft hum of the place, she swallowed a piece of news designed to be ugly. It was one thing to be part of a company whose work was on display. It was another to have someone suggest that her competence could be reduced to favoritism. A practical anger rose in her, sharp and hot, and with it a familiar protection of the private parts of her life that had been hard-won after loss. That evening at Rafael's penthouse, she said nothing at first.
The city lights coppered against the window panes while they ate leftovers from an earlier dinner. Rafael checked his messages, then looked up and found her face closed in a way he hadn't seen before. "Isabella?" he asked. She placed the article on the table like an offering and watched him read. He felt the small, cold hand of panic in his stomach. The world narrowed to the printed words. He had expected indignation, calls for statements, and angry conversation with a PR team. He had not expected to see in her eyes a tiredness that resembled grief, a feeling of being judged for being both woman and professional. "I can deal with this," he said, too quickly, because he wanted to fix the problem the way he fixed technical debt, clear the backlog, push a hotfix. But she was not talking about a technical issue. "I know you can," she replied, "but sometimes the cost is more than a press release."
Sometimes it's the way people look at you in meetings, or the fact that your name becomes the background noise in our conversation. He reached across the table for her hand. "We can set rules," he said, the CEO's toolkit switching on like a reflex. "Official disclosure, recusal where needed, HR policies. I can manage this." She shook her head. "It's not only that. It's about whether I want my career to be defined by what others think." She was measured, her words precise, practiced, and the fact that she was agonizing aloud made the moment feel like an incision. "I came back because my grandmother needed me. I came here because I wanted to build something, professionally and personally. I don't want my work to be footnotes to a narrative I didn't author." There were no clever retorts in his chest this time, only a slow, insistent understanding. He thought of the grandmother she had mentioned so often, of how responsibility had shaped Isabella into a woman who measured decisions against a ledger of duty and tenderness. He thought of his own father's departures and the way Rafael had learned to compress disappointment into efficiency. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I didn't think about how this would land for you." She listened a beat. "I know you didn't," she allowed, "and I don't want to be the person who slows you down." The last part of her sentence was almost a confession. She had spent years proving her competence. The fear that her presence might complicate Rafael's work felt like a betrayal of everything she had fought to build. For a week, they agreed on public boundaries and private distance. Work became a buffer of polite professionalism. They communicated in schedules and short messages. The intimacy that had felt like a slow tide now retreated into the hold of a ship when a storm passed. They were careful and not careless. In the gap, quiet questions multiplied. Did she feel she should step back? Would his willingness to insulate the company from gossip appear to others as a shield around him and not for them? The way they navigated those questions mattered more than any press release. Rafael found himself waking with the old, uneasy mornings returning. The dreams that had once been a gentle tug now unsettled again. He had imagined that naming a problem would be enough to dissolve it, as if language could spare the heart the work of steadiness. It did not. In the early hours when the city was a hush and the river of headlights flowed like slow lumens, the memory of their laughter at a piece of burned risotto, or their shared bewilderment during a failed deploy returned loud and intimate. He missed the tactile certainties of being in the room with her when a server went down. That frayed familiarity felt like safety. Marcos, who watched his partner in the company with a strange mixture of affection and pragmatic concern, called Rafael one afternoon and asked to meet in the old way, in a small bar, low light and cheap beer. "You two are solid," Marcos said after half a beer and a long breath. "But you let the world talk to you too loud sometimes. You fix things because that's what you do, but not everything needs a fix." Rafael understood. He had been trained to solve, to convert ambiguity into actionable items. Love did not always offer a problem statement. Some days it offered only the invitation to remain. It was in that unsettled week that Isabella received an invitation to present at a small conference in Porto Alegre, an opportunity to speak about product analytics and ethical design. It was a career moment, plausible and earned. She called Rafael, telling him of the acceptance with a voice that was careful not to announce separation. "I'll be gone for 3 days," she said. "It's a talk about our middleware approach. I can include the Petrotech case if you want." Rafael, who had been living in the liminal space between professionalism and intimacy, found himself surprised by the warmth that rose in him at her professional success. "Take it," he said. "You should go." She paused. "Are you sure?" He realized the question wasn't about the trip. It was a test of trust. "I'm sure," he replied. She went. The conference was a success. Colleagues texted photos of her on stage, candid, confident. Rafael, left with the space of an empty bed and an apartment that felt too vast, focused on the company's tactical needs, and in the quiet of late afternoons, read her slides again to savor the way she phrased user empathy. He also found himself checking his phone, waiting for a message that would be mundane. The flight is delayed, yet felt like proof. When it came, in the small blue ticks of digital presence, he answered with the care of someone aware of what could be lost. Meanwhile, the pilot at Petrotech began to show traction. Metrics looked promising. The middleware approach had smoothed a major choke point. The company celebrated with a low-key champagne on a Friday afternoon. Cheers around the terrace, a playlist of soft jazz in the background, a congratulatory text thread buzzing with emojis. Isabella, whose professional life always remained a separate, resounding axis, received praise from project leads for her clear-headed coordination. The public speculation that had once threatened them began to fade as metrics vindicated the work. But narrative vulnerabilities exist beyond performance dashboards. In the middle of a celebratory toast, Rafael saw an email he could not unsee. A confidential note from a venture capitalist exploring an acquisition whisper. Nothing was defined, only suggested. That evening, he walked home with the taste of bubbles still on his tongue and a new kind of vertigo in his chest. An acquisition would change everything. The control he had, the shape of the company, the rhythms of obligations. It would also mean making choices that would ripple into the delicate balance of his personal life.
He thought of Isabella and the way she had regarded professional life as a field of competency separate from romance. He thought of the morning when she had set a coin in her pocket for luck, when she had shared that story of her grandmother. Decisions on acquisitions are by nature made in rooms where feelings are not meant to factor. Yet he also knew that love had an architecture that did not obey press releases. In the days that followed, Rafael retreated into the necessary management of the potential acquisition. There were meetings with legal, non-disclosure agreements, and an analytics of possibilities. He had always been good at seeing a system as a series of interconnected parts. This time, the pieces included a woman he loved. He wondered aloud, one night on the couch, whether selling might be a way to trade the stress and the public scrutiny for a life less surveilled. Isabella listened. She was not naive about the trade-offs of corporate life. Her years in Silicon Valley had taught her the calculus of exits. "If you sell," she asked simply, "what legacy do you want to leave? And where do we fit in that picture?" Her question was not selfish. It asked him to articulate priorities. He tried, in the way he always had, to map scenario analysis and risk. She watched him sketch metaphors with his hands, and then, more gently than he expected, she said, "Whatever you decide, remember why you built this. Not every sale is a loss. Sometimes it's a new beginning. But make sure the decision is for you, not for inertia." Her counsel steadied him. It was the kind of partnership that felt less like rescue and more like a mutual calibration. It was, Rafael realized, the very thing he had been afraid to allow himself. A life in which personal and professional decisions were shared, not because they had to be, but because they were chosen together. The misunderstanding that would follow did not originate in malice. It began in the boardroom, where an innocent comment about the board's desire for stability and predictability was spun into a rumor that Rafael was leaning towards selling to avoid a prolonged PR battle. The blog resurfaced with a more speculative tone. This time, however, the reaction inside the company was more measured. Investors, who had seen the steadiness of months, demanded clarity but also offered patient queries. Still, the undercurrent of a sale, of a decision that could restructure people's lives, opened up old questions about loyalty and identity. Isabella read about the renewed rumors on a Sunday when she had come to Rafael's place to cook brunch and paint with watercolors, an old habit of hers that relaxed a mind attuned to code and margins. The way the words on the screen arranged themselves suggested urgency. She folded the laptop closed and looked at Rafael. "If you sell," she said, not because she intended to pressure, but because she needed to know the shape of what might be coming. "Will we still be us?"
His answer was not immediate. He had been balancing spreadsheets and hearts, and had a new appreciation for the difficulty of honesty when both mattered. He looked at her, at the quiet ache in her expression, at the small calluses on her fingers from typing late into the night, and realized he did not want to be a man who made a decision without offering his partner her place in the reasoning. "No," he said finally, not because he had decided, but because he wanted to clarify his default. "I don't want to make that decision alone." She smiled, but the smile had the shape of a question mark, good faith mixed with caution. They were together, but there were tests ahead. The test, when it came, had the merciless clarity of a natural experiment. An email, forwarded by a journalist and taken out of context, claimed that a leaked internal memo suggested preferential terms for Petrotech due to personal ties. It was not true, but truth is sometimes less swift than rumor. Suddenly, the company was back in quiet defensive mode. Rafael doubled down on transparency.
He offered to make the procurement documentation public where possible and to invite an independent technical review. He insisted that Isabella recuse herself from any decision where Petrotech's interests would be tangibly linked to her role. The measures were concrete and sensible, but they felt like a wedge. Isabella, always the professional, accepted the recusal and threw herself into work, as if competence could immunize against suspicion. But at night she would come to Rafael's apartment later than usual, her shoulders a hair tighter, and sometimes she would not speak when she touched his arm or cup of coffee. He recognized the strain in those small silences, and they began to accumulate like unpaid invoices. One evening, after a week of such tensions, Isabella arrived and sat on the terrace under the soft spill of the city lights. She looked at the horizon as it might offer a map. She had been spending long hours at the office, and the fatigue showed at the edges of her eyes. "I don't want to be the reason your company becomes cautious," she said. Her voice had the flatness of someone who had rehearsed the sentence. "I don't want to be the center of a story that reduces me to a footnote." Rafael felt a familiar, subterranean panic. This was not about optics or stakeholders. It was about the literal erosion of their cussability. "If you step away," he said, testing the idea that had started as an offer of protection and had become a real, dangerous thought, "it will be because you choose to, not because the world forces you." "You say that," she replied, looking at him sharply, "but the events make it harder to imagine a career that isn't constantly explained away. I can't keep proving that my work is not only character. Sometimes it's exhausting." He reached for her hand. "Then let me be better at protecting us in a way that doesn't ask you to shrink."
She laughed then, a small, incredulous sound. "Maybe protection is a bad word," she said. "Maybe it sounds like containment. I don't want to be kept safe in a cage." "No cage," he said. "Just partnership." The word landed between them, imperfect and true. But words alone weren't going to clear the air. They needed a proof of intent that was not a policy memo. Rafael resolved, quietly and deliberately, to offer a different kind of argument. One not drafted for governance, but in the vocabulary of their private connection. He thought back to his dreams, the shore, the laugh, the sense of recognition, and understood that whatever mystery those dreams carried, they had catalyzed choices he no longer wanted to retract. He wanted a gesture that would fold the public optics into a private promise. He planned. He did not involve legal or PR or even Marcos. He organized a picnic in Ibirapuera Park under the specific tree Isabella had once mentioned in passing, the great tree she'd recognized from childhood memories and referenced as a place that held memory. He imagined that a proposal, small, intimate, and profoundly uncorporate, might be the counterweight to the rumor's gravity. On the chosen day, the park was washed in late summer light. The grass smelled faintly of dust and cut stems. The city's distant drone receded into a comfortable hum. Rafael arrived early and set the picnic with an almost ceremonial care: a wool blanket, a wicker basket lined in blue, bottles of sparkling water, a small tin of her favorite pound de queijo, and a slim hardcover book she had once recommended. He had a ring, modest, not ostentatious, set with a small warm gem that seemed to gather light rather than glare. It was not a diamond purchased for spectacle, but a thoughtful thing he had chosen with the same deliberation he brought to product design. She arrived wearing a denim jacket and a scarf, hair pulled back as if she had expected a walk. When she saw the blanket and the way he had laid everything out, her face broke into a surprised smile that made him feel like a man who had found a secret door and left a light burning. They sat side by side under the tree and talked like people who had learned each other's vocabulary, about the pilot, about the PR headaches, about a program the company might start to offer education for women in tech. The conversation moved easily until Rafael grew quiet. He reached into the basket and retrieved the ring. It was a small action, private and rather clumsy, because his hands were not used to gestures of this type. He did not stand. He did not make a speech rehearsed like a corporate deck. He looked at her, the woman who had been a nightly image and who had become an everyday constancy, and felt a well of emotion that was precise and honest. "Isabella," he said, and his voice was steady with the kind of calm that comes from having considered more angles than he had ever considered a heart could be.
"I've built things because I was afraid to live without certainty. You made me realize that certainty isn't the only way to be safe. I want to make a choice that is not defensive. I want us to make a life where both the work and whatever we build at home feel like part of the same architecture. Will you marry me? Will you stay and continue building with me? Not because you have to, but because you want to." There was a silence like the pause between two notes, a measure of held breath. Isabella's eyes filled not with an immediate overflow, but with a slow, brightening clarity. Memories of her grandmother, of trains and small coins for luck, seemed to press gently at the edges of the moment. She took his hands in both of hers, and in the way she had learned to be direct with people who valued precision, she answered simply, "Yes, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger like a gentle promise. It fit as if it had been waiting for that particular measure. Around them the park murmured, distant laughter, the clatter of a bicycle, and though they were still in the city, they had made a small, private country in a patch of grass under a tree. The months that followed were not a story of untroubled bliss. There were boardroom negotiations about transparency, legal teams drafting clear compliance documents that allowed them to work together without conflict, and a public statement that acknowledged their relationship while affirming a structure of checks and balances. People had opinions, of course. Office gossip is a type of weather in any company, and sometimes it rained in the wrong season. But the change was real. They had declared their intent, and the declaration dissolved many of the cheap narratives that had once been thrown at them. The wedding planning was an extension of who they were. It was intimate and purposeful. They did not opt for spectacle. They chose a small ceremony on Copacabana Beach, a place that had been in Rafael's early dreams and that had shaped Isabella's memories of Sunday walks and the smell of salt. The guest list included family and close friends, Marcos standing at Rafael's side, Carla arranging the logistics like a quiet general, and a few colleagues who had become friends. They included one special item in the ceremony, a sprig of rosemary in each boutonniere, a small tribute to the grandmother who had shaped Isabella's life, and whose coin for luck had been a story told and retold until its edges became a covenant. On the morning of the wedding, the city seemed to align itself in favor. The sun rose with a gentleness that turned the sea a polished copper. The ceremony was small and hushed, a handful of chairs on the sand, the sound of the guitar playing an arrangement of a bossa nova standard that felt familiar and fresh. Isabella walked barefoot, her dress tracing the line between modesty and joy.
Raphael's hands trembled just slightly when he took her in his. The moment had the gravity of someone who had learned to accept mystery with courage. They exchanged vows that were not long, but were precise, like contracts written in the language of the heart. Raphael promised to listen, to share decisions, and to build a home that valued warmth over perfection. Isabella promised to bring the pragmatic tenderness that had been her hallmark into their household, and to continue being a person with a career and autonomy. They sealed their words with a kiss that tasted faintly of salt and lemon. After the ceremony, friends and family walked along the boardwalk as if the world had shifted its axis slightly to make room for a new constellation. In the evenings after their wedding, they returned to the small gestures that had become the marrow of their life together. There were dinners where the risotto still burned at the edges and was eaten anyway, lazy Sunday mornings where they read separate books and shared paragraphs, and workdays where they met in the company kitchen to discuss an integration or a sprint plan, then left to take their part in the concerts of a startup's demands. They moved in and out of public life with a steadier gait. It was not immunity from scrutiny, but it was a life chosen and defended. Raphael's dreams, the ones that had begun this sequence, did not disappear as if a problem had been solved. They changed shape. Sometimes the shore appeared, but now he saw Isabella's face in the light, and the scene felt less like a prophecy than a memory, a first draft of a life that had been revised by choice. Other nights the dreams were quiet and nonspecific, the scent of salt, the sound of laughter without a visible source. He learned to treat them as edges of himself, not as a map with absolute answers. There were other developments. Marcos took on a new role within the company that allowed him the creative freedom he had sought without leaving the community, and Carla celebrated a small promotion to head operations, a recognition of the order she had always maintained. The Petrotech pilot graduated into a long-term contract that required constant attention but affirmed the company's technical credibility. The small victories accrued like interest. The tree in Ibirapuera remained a place they visited. Sometimes they took picnic lunches there on a weekday, hiding in the green like an unadvertised room. Once, when Isabella was tired and the pressure of a new initiative made her shoulders tight, they lay on the blanket and listened to the city breathe. She took his hand and said quietly, "Do you ever think about how it all started with a dream?" He thought about the nights he had woken with the echo of a laugh lodged in his chest, and the way that sound had rearranged his priorities. "I do," he admitted, "but I also think about choices. Dreams pointed me somewhere, but choosing to go, that was us."
They sat there under the tree and watched a family walk past, a child chasing a balloon that snagged on a bench and unfurled like a small, persistent hope. In that simplicity, They felt the curvature of a life not guaranteed, but made real by the steady accumulation of decisions. Years later, standing on a terrace in their shared apartment, with a view that captured both the city and the sea, Rafael sometimes found himself answering questions he had once asked himself in the hush before dawn. He had built an empire not to prove he could be alone, but because he had feared what would happen if he stopped building. Isabella had taught him that building could be collaborative and that vulnerability did not necessarily equal ruin. Together, they had navigated reputations and rumors, contracts and condolences, and in the creases of that navigation, they had folded a home. On their 10th anniversary, they walked along Copacabana at dusk, the sea reflecting a sky that had the color of their first memory together. They stopped at the ribbon of sand where his dreams had first known her and stood in the same spot as if to mark a line. They did not need to say much. They had said it all in the small gestures, the pocket toothbrush, the shared playlists, the way they argued and reconciled and chose one another again and again. If someone asked Rafael whether he believed in fate or coincidence, he would answer with the practical humility of a man who had learned to value both. Dreams, he would say, had been a summons, but a summons only becomes a life when you answer it with action, when you choose to stay, to protect, to risk, to make promises, and then keep them. The woman he had once seen only at night had become, with no supernatural decree, the person who rearranged the center of his compass because he let her in. They walked home with the sound of the ocean and the wash of the city pressed to their ankles. At the apartment, they hung a small photograph above the hallway table, a picture of the two of them under the Ibirapuera tree, smiles smaller and wider at once, the sky behind them in ordinary enormous blue. It was a reminder of beginnings that had been both mysterious and deliberate. And sometimes, late on certain nights when the city quieted and the world narrowed to a single room, Rafael would wake with the echo of that first laugh in his memory. He would not be alarmed. He would fold the dream like a letter and place it in the file of things that matter. A note about how life can sometimes introduce you to what you were missing before you even knew it, and how the only reliable explanation is the one you make with other people. If this story of unlikely recognition, quiet repair, and the courage to choose love moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic tales of connection and second chances.